An arrogant pilot thought humiliating Big Shaq in first class would be forgotten at 30,000 feet. But arrogance clouded the cockpit, and a single act of disrespect triggered a downfall no one could stop. Big Shaq rose with silent power, while the golden badge crumbled under the weight of truth. When the runway finally met the wheels, it wasn't just a landing, it was a reckoning. And for the arrogant pilot, the real crash was still to come. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun bled gold across the airport windows, scattering thick beams of light over polished marble floors. It was the kind of day that made even chaos look calm. A day dressed in brightness and charm, where no one expected storms to brew beneath perfect skies. Inside the exclusive first-class lounge of Westbridge International Airport, everything gleamed. The crystal chandeliers, the silver cutlery, the faces of the well-dressed, quietly confident travelers. It smelled faintly of leather, roasted coffee, and the sharp tang of jet fuel soaked into the bones of the place. Shaquille O'Neal moved through the lounge with an ease that belied his size. Towering, unmistakable, yet somehow invisible in a sea of hurried businessmen and high-heeled influencers. He wore a gray hoodie stretched across his broad back and a pair of worn sneakers that had seen better days. There was no entourage today, no booming laughter, no autographs, just a man quietly taking his place among people too busy with themselves to see the giant heart beating behind the giant frame. He found a seat tucked away by a floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the runway buzzed with ground crews darting like ants around gleaming jets. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath fogging against the chilled glass, and pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes. He wasn't running from fame, he just wasn't chasing it anymore. This trip wasn't about basketball, brands, or boardrooms. It was personal, a promise made months ago to speak at a small-town fundraiser, to help rebuild a youth center that had burned down, a cause too close to his heart to ignore. As he sipped a lukewarm coffee, the room hummed with soft conversations and the clinking of fine china. Across the lounge, a sleek woman in a navy pantsuit tapped at a laptop. A trio of suited men chuckled over whiskey, flashing titanium watches and perfect veneers. No one seemed to recognize Shaq, or if they did, they respected the invisible boundary his quiet demeanor drew. A low voice buzzed over the lounge speakers, announcing that Flight 1127 to Washington, D.C. would begin pre-boarding soon. Shaq's gaze flicked to his boarding pass. First class, a small luxury he rarely indulged in for himself but accepted this time, not for comfort but for the short window it gave him, to disappear into the clouds without being bothered. He stood, stretching his back, and gathered his duffel bag, an old, battered thing stitched with patches from different corners of the world. No matter where he went, Shaq carried pieces of people he'd helped, lessons he'd learned. It was heavier than it looked. As he made his way to the gate, a pair of sharp eyes tracked him from across the lounge. Captain Holden Reeves leaned against the bar, a tumbler of water in his hand, wearing his pristine pilot uniform like armor. His jaw clenched ever so slightly as he watched the giant figure of Shaq stride toward the gate. To Holden, the lounge was a sacred space, a silent acknowledgement of status, success, and power. Seeing a man like Shaq, a man he judged without knowing, in a seat that should have been reserved for real success stories, spark a quiet flame of resentment. Holden smirked, finishing his drink in one quick toss. It wasn't just the size that bothered him, it was what Shaq represented. In Holden's mind, no amount of humility could erase the fact that some people were handed fame, while others like him had to claw and bleed for respect, for recognition. It wasn't rational, but it simmered in his gut like bad whiskey. Shaq reached the gate, where a young agent named Olivia Hart checked his boarding pass. Her eyes widened for a heartbeat, the instant flash of recognition, before she schooled her face into polite professionalism. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. O'Neal," she whispered with a small, genuine smile. He tipped his cap in thanks, and moved down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the cabin gleamed under the white glow of LED lighting. Rows of first-class seats, spread wide, leather cushions cradling the wealthy few who could afford such luxury. Shaq settled into his assigned seat by the window, his frame swallowing the space, but he didn't complain. He folded his hands loosely over his stomach, and closed his eyes, willing the world to shrink for a little while. The boarding process dragged on, a parade of briefcases, designer bags, and hollow laughter. Then the voice crackled to life over the cabin speakers, a voice thick with forced charm and the undertone of something sour. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Captain Holden Reeves. We're just about ready to push back from the gate. First of all, a special shout out to our VIP guest in seat 1A. I hope you fit comfortably back there, big guy. A few passengers chuckled awkwardly. A woman coughed to hide a laugh. Shaq opened his eyes slowly. The seatbelt buckle cold under his palms. He didn't move, didn't react, but the words burned hotter than the Florida sun outside the window. He knew that kind of insult, veiled, public, cowardly. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. But each time it scraped against the part of him that still believed in people's better angels. He turned his head slightly and caught a glimpse of Captain Reeves through the small crack of the cockpit door. Holden wore a smug grin as he adjusted his headset. Shaq inhaled deeply through his nose, anchoring himself to the lessons his mother had drilled into him years ago. You cannot fight small minds with small hearts. The plane taxied out onto the runway. Engines hummed louder, vibrating through the floor beneath Shaq's sneakers. As the wheels lifted off the ground, carrying 200 lives into the blue expanse, Shaq stared out the window. He wasn't angry, not really. He was disappointed. Disappointed that even after everything, the world still needed reminders that humanity was not earned by money, class or color. At 30,000 feet, peace should have come. But something gnawed at the edge of Shaq's mind, an unease that had nothing to do with the cheap shot over the speaker. He noticed it in the way the plane tilted slightly harder than necessary during the climb. In the sharp exchanges between flight attendants, their smiles stretched too tight. In the muted curse that slipped from the cockpit door when a stewardess knocked to deliver coffee. This wasn't an ordinary flight. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling the seatbelt sign was off. Passengers shifted, stood, unlatched tray tables with soft clicks. A child's giggle broke the tension for a moment, but Shaq stayed rooted in his seat, hands clasped, eyes scanning the plane like a soldier reading the battlefield. Across the aisle, a thin man in a worn bomber jacket, someone who didn't fit the slick first-class mold, watched the cockpit with a predator's focus. Shaq noticed the slight bulge of a worn notebook peeking from the man's inner pocket, the rapid scribbles he made every few minutes. Instinct told Shaq he wasn't just another traveler. For the first time since boarding, Shaq felt the air thicken with something invisible, something just beginning to stir. The voice of Captain Reeves interrupted again, dripping with false brightness. Folks, sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. After all, it's not every day you get flown by the best. The cabin speaker popped with static as the announcement ended. Shaq leaned back slowly, his gaze narrowing. It wasn't just arrogance. It was desperation. He recognized the difference, and desperation in the cockpit was more dangerous than turbulence, more dangerous than any insult whispered through a smile. Outside, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, a perfect blue canvas hiding invisible currents of chaos. Inside, Shaq felt it. The crack in the calm, the fracture before the fall. This flight was not going to end the way anyone expected. And somewhere deep in his gut, Shaq knew he wasn't just a passenger today. He was about to become something much more. The interior of Flight 127 gleamed with polished chrome and spotless leather as Shaq stepped onto the plane. His massive frame seemed to swallow the narrow jet bridge behind him. But he moved with the quiet grace of someone used to folding himself into spaces too small to hold all that he was. His cap stayed low over his brow, and his hands were empty except for a worn duffel slung casually over one shoulder. Despite his size and undeniable presence, Shaq blended into the subtle chaos of boarding. Just another traveler, another soul trying to reach somewhere that mattered. Passengers already seated in first class turned their heads, some out of curiosity, others out of recognition, and a few with the tight-lipped discomfort that comes from facing someone their biases warned them against before their better sense could catch up. A middle-aged man in a blue blazer nudged his wife and muttered something under his breath. A teenage boy's face lit up with the glee of instant recognition, but his mother's firm hand on his arm reminded him not to make a scene. Shaq caught all of it, the glances, the whispers, the hidden smiles and wary eyes, and met them with the same silent humility he had perfected over a lifetime of standing out. He moved to his seat, 1A, tucked against the window at the very front of the cabin. The leather seat creaked gently under his weight as he settled in, adjusting his long legs to fit the confined space. A stewardess approached, her name tag reading Jenna, and she offered a tight but polite smile, handing him a glass of sparkling water without waiting for him to ask. He accepted it with a nod, careful to avoid the glass shattering in his oversized hands. Every motion he made was deliberate, considerate, a testament to a man who knew he was always being watched, weighed, measured, and too often found wanting for reasons beyond his control. As the last of the first-class passengers trickled in, a ripple of energy stirred near the cockpit. Captain Holden Reeves made his entrance with a swagger that didn't belong anywhere near the quiet professionalism expected from a man responsible for 200 lives. His uniform was crisp, gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves. But there was something performative in the way he carried himself, as if he believed the jacket granted him a superiority no mere mortal could question. Holden's eyes swept the first-class cabin, with the casual dominance of a man surveying his kingdom, and then they landed on Shaq. The brief flicker of recognition was immediate, followed by a tightening of the jaw and a narrowing of the eyes that spoke volumes. Holden didn't just see a celebrity, he saw a challenge to his unspoken belief in who belonged where. The moment passed, but not without leaving a stain in the air, a crackle of something meaner than simple arrogance. As the plane's door sealed shut with a mechanical hiss and the engines began to thrum beneath the floor, Holden picked up the intercom, with the slow, theatrical flair of a man about to claim center stage. His voice spilled into the cabin, smooth and dripping with affected charm. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Holden Reeves speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 0127 to Washington, D.C. Weather's looking clear, and we should have a smooth ride today. Now, before we take off, I'd like to extend a special welcome to one of our distinguished passengers sitting in seat 1A. Hope you're comfortable there, big guy. Might need to reinforce the landing gear today, huh?" The words hung in the air, slicing through the cabin with the precision of a scalpel. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then a few awkward chuckles scattered among the passengers. Someone muttered a low, uncomfortable "damn" under their breath. Jenna, the stewardess, turned an alarming shade of pink and busied herself pretending to adjust the overhead compartments. Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He simply stared out the window at the endless expanse of runway, his expression unreadable. But inside, the blow landed harder than any punch he had taken on the court. It wasn't the first time he'd been the target of a joke made at his expense, dressed up in the thin veneer of humor. It wasn't even the worst, but there was something about the setting, the carefully cultivated exclusivity of first class, the invisible lines drawn between us and them, that made the humiliation sharper, more deliberate. He felt the weight of every set of eyes on him. The curious, the pitying, the vindicated. He could hear the unspoken narrative spinning in the heads of those who laughed and those who looked away. Too big, too loud, too different. A reminder that even at 30,000 feet, prejudice could find you, cloaked in a joke, wrapped in a smile. But Shaq had learned long ago that dignity was not something anyone could strip from you, unless you let them. He breathed in deeply, letting the cold recycled air fill his lungs, and exhaled slow and steady. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't crack a smile to make others comfortable or clap back to satisfy his pride. He sat in the storm and let it rage around him, untouched. Holden Reeves, sensing no immediate retaliation, smirked to himself in the cockpit. To him it was just another clever jab, another reminder of the pecking order he believed he controlled. He didn't know, couldn't possibly know that the ripples of his arrogance were already setting into motion events that would spiral far beyond the confines of this flight. The engines roared louder as the plane taxied onto the runway. Shaq buckled his seatbelt, his large hands moving with mechanical precision. Outside the window, the world blurred into streaks of green and gray. Inside, he anchored himself to memories of his mother's voice, soft but unbreakable. "You are not what they call you. You are what you choose to answer to." As the plane lifted off, shuddering under the sudden pull of gravity and thrust, Shaq felt the shift in his gut, a premonition almost. This flight wasn't just another trip across the country. Something was wrong, not just with the pilot's attitude, but deeper, more dangerous. It was in the way the plane banked too sharply on ascent, in the way the flight attendants whispered hurriedly to each other when they thought no one was looking. Shaq's eyes found the man in the bomber jacket again, a few rows back. The man wasn't watching the in-flight safety video, or fiddling with his phone like everyone else. He was watching the cockpit door, watching Holden Reeves. The crack in the column widened, invisible but real. And Shaq knew, with a clarity that tightened his chest, that the insult over the intercom was only the first crack in a dam about to burst. The sky stretched endlessly outside his window, beautiful and bright, and utterly indifferent to the small battles raging inside the metal tube slicing through its heart. Shaq sat back, adjusting his seat slightly, and prepared for the kind of turbulence no seatbelt sign could warn you about. Some storms, he knew, didn't announce themselves with thunder. They whispered first, coiled silent in the spaces between false smiles and careless jokes, waiting for the moment to strike. And on this flight, the storm had already begun. The cabin seemed to shrink after the captain's announcement, every polished surface and muted fabric closing in like walls. The atmosphere, once humming with the casual comfort of first-class privilege, had turned brittle, fragile as spun glass. No one spoke openly, but the tension cracked in the tight smiles, the quick glances, the uneasy shifting in seats. Silent judgments passed between passengers like invisible currency, traded behind polite expressions and whispered conversations. A woman across the aisle fiddled with the clasp on her designer purse, pretending to adjust it but really trying not to meet Shaq's eyes. An older man in a sharp pinstripe suit tapped at his tablet with unnecessary force, his body language broadcasting discomfort louder than any words could. Somewhere farther back, a stifled laugh burst out, quickly hushed. It wasn't just about the joke anymore, it was about how everyone chose to respond to it. Shaq sat immovable in his seat, the window's light framing him in gold, a silent monument to restraint. The coffee he had ordered earlier remained untouched on the tray table, the ice slowly melting into pale rings. Inside, the sting of humiliation throbbed, a dull, familiar ache that had nothing to do with the joke itself and everything to do with the reminder it carried, that no matter how high you climbed, there would always be someone eager to drag you back to the ground. He could have reacted. He could have stood up and demanded an apology, turned the cabin into a courtroom with passengers as his jury. He could have matched arrogance with righteous fury and crushed it beneath the weight of his presence. But Shaq chose a different path, not because he was weak, but because he was stronger than the moment deserved. Grace wasn't the easy choice. It was the harder one. It always had been. Outside the window, clouds unfurled in endless white fields below, pure and untouched by the small ugliness brewing inside the plane. Shaq let his mind drift there, to that vast silence, and anchored himself. He thought of his mother, Lucille, of the afternoons spent sitting on cracked concrete stoops while she taught him lessons that the world refused to. Dignity is not something you ask for. It's something you wear like armor. The world can try to tear it from you, but only if you let go first. He wouldn't let go now. Still, the weight of every pair of eyes, those who pitied, those who judged, those who feared, pressed against him like invisible hands. He could feel their discomfort clawing at the edges of civility, their desperate attempts to pretend nothing had happened, to move on as if a wound could heal itself simply by ignoring it. The hum of engines filled the void where decency should have spoken. Time stretched thin as the plane cut through the sky. Every sound seemed amplified. The rustle of a newspaper, the clink of ice in a glass, the too loud snap of a seatbelt being adjusted. It was as if the entire cabin held its breath, waiting for a spark to either ignite or dissipate the tension. Shaq shifted slightly in his seat, drawing his shoulders back, reclaiming his space without aggression, without apology. He didn't need to speak to tell the cabin who he was. His silence was a declaration in itself. Yet beneath the quiet, something deeper stirred, something unrelated to the captain's ugly attempt at humor. Shaq's instincts, honed through years of navigating hostile courts, hostile crowds, hostile conversations, prickled with unease. It wasn't just personal now. There was a wrongness to the flight itself, a subtle discord that had nothing to do with prejudice and everything to do with danger. He noticed it in the way the plane shuddered intermittently, not enough to alarm but enough to whisper that something wasn't right. He saw it in the way Jenna, the stewardess, fumbled with the coffee pot and shot nervous glances toward the cockpit, as if dreading another summons. He felt it in the way Captain Holden Reeves spoke over the intercom, too casual, too flippant for a man responsible for so many lives, the edge of bravado hiding something rotten underneath. Across the aisle, the man in the bomber jacket, the one with the notebook, continued to scribble furiously, his eyes never lingering on any one thing for too long. Shaq caught a glimpse of what he was writing in a quick flash. Codes, acronyms, notations that looked more official than personal. Whoever he wasn't just a concerned passenger. He was watching, documenting, building a case against something unseen but dangerously real. Shaq turned his gaze back to the window, letting the motion of the plane lull his body even as his mind raced. He could almost hear Lucille's voice again, threading through the noise. Stay alert. Not every threat comes with a warning. The minutes dragged. A stewardess announced that in-flight service would be delayed, citing minor turbulence. though the sky outside was as clear as a polished mirror. Another stewardess, barely concealing her stress, passed out bottled water with hands that trembled just enough for Shaq to notice. Passengers began to murmur again, uneasy and restless. A man 2 rows back pressed his call button repeatedly, before giving up in frustration. A woman in a bright red dress clutched her armrest a little tighter every time the plane gave a slight unnatural lurch. Fear seeped into the cabin like smoke, thin, invisible, but choking all the same. Shaq closed his eyes, not in sleep but in meditation, scanning the situation the way he used to scan the court before a crucial play. Pieces were moving, tension was building, and the man in control of the plane wasn't someone Shaq trusted anymore. Not with an insult, and certainly not with their lives. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Subtle alliances formed among strangers. Shared glances, whispered reassurances, silent agreements to watch each other's backs. In first class, where self-interest often ruled supreme, a fragile sense of community blossomed under the shadow of uncertainty. Shaq remained the still center of it all. The unspoken leader no one elected, but everyone leaned toward. His reputation wasn't just built on fame or fortune. It was built on resilience, on the countless times he had faced adversity and chosen to lift others, instead of dragging them down. He knew without doubt that something was coming. A slight tilt of the wings, a change in engine pitch, a flicker of something unspoken between the stewardesses as they passed each other mid-aisle, their eyes wide with things they couldn't say aloud. Holden's voice returned over the speakers, this time with a brittle edge beneath the forced humor. "Don't worry, folks. Just a little mid-air shakeup. Nothing this fine piece of machinery can't handle. After all, you've got the best hands in the business flying you today." The words dripped with bravado, but they didn't soothe. They only deepened the fissure running through the cabin's collective heart. Shaq opened his eyes and watched the man in the bomber jacket rise subtly from his seat. Pretend to stretch, then linger by the galley as if waiting for a bathroom to open. But Shaq saw the real target, the cockpit door. There was a plan unfolding, one built not on panic but preparation. Shaq felt the shift again, this time not from the engines but from inside himself. He knew that before this flight was over, he would have to act, not with anger, not with violence, but with the same grace that had brought him through every other storm, standing tall when others bowed or broke. The sky outside remained deceptively calm. A painting of peace stretched across the horizon. But inside Flight 1127, the storm had already taken root. And as the minutes ticked forward, silent eyes watched and loud hearts beat against cages of fear and hope, bracing for the moment when everything would change. The hum of the engines became a low, steady heartbeat against the steel walls of the cabin. Shaq leaned back in his seat, but his mind refused to settle. Beyond the polite smiles and neatly pressed uniforms, something dark lurked just beneath the surface, something more dangerous than turbulence. Yet it wasn't the unease of the flight alone that tightened his chest. It was the familiar ache threading itself through his ribs, the old wounds that Holden Reeves's casual cruelty had ripped open again. He closed his eyes, and without meaning to, let memory take him. He was 8 years old again, standing outside a corner store on a hot Florida afternoon, barefoot and dust-streaked. His mother, Lucille O'Neill, towered beside him, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder. Inside the store, a clerk watched them with hawk-like suspicion, the kind of stare that carried accusations without words. Shaq remembered how small he had felt, how guilty though he hadn't done a thing wrong. Lucille had refused to shrink. She walked Shaq through that store with her chin high, her movements deliberate, her voice soft but strong whenever she spoke. When they left, empty-handed and burning under the gaze that followed them, she knelt down so that her face was level with his. "People are going to see you and think they know you," she had said, her hands cradling his face. "Because you're big, because you're black, because they don't know any better. But you don't answer to their ignorance. You answer to who you are." At 8 years old, he hadn't fully understood. At 8 years old, he only knew that the world could be unfair, and that his mother's pride had armor-plated his skin. The memory faded, but left a lingering weight. Settling into the pit of his stomach, he opened his eyes, bringing himself back to the polished cabin. The tight smiles, the forced politeness stretched over something rotten. Captain Holden Reeves's words over the PA system weren't just a casual slight. They were a flashback, a time machine dragging Shaq back through years of layered microaggressions and outright discrimination. And every time he thought the world had moved forward, Moments like this reminded him how deep old roots ran. Shaq shifted in his seat, glancing around the cabin. Some passengers were still avoiding his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in magazines or sleep. Others watched him with a furtive sympathy that tasted like pity, and he didn't know which was worse. Pity asked nothing of you. It simply observed, helpless and useless. Lucille had never taught him to crave pity. She had taught him to demand respect, not with fists, not with rage, but with an unbreakable presence. To own space without apology. The plane trembled lightly, a ripple that passed through the floor like a shiver. Another reminder that the danger aboard wasn't just emotional. Shaq stayed alert, keenly aware of every subtle change, in the plane, in the people, in the charged energy floating through the recycled air. And then the memories kept coming, as memories tend to do when stirred by the right amount of anger and grief. He saw himself at 15, towering over his classmates, too large to blend in, and too black to be invisible. The night a white coach had told him he should smile more, so he wouldn't scare the recruiters. The night he went home and asked Lucille if his smile would really change the way people looked at him. She had sat him down at the rickety kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. Her words were simple but heavy enough to anchor his heart. Your smile is yours. It's not armor for their fear. It's a gift. You don't owe it to anyone. He carried that lesson into adulthood, into arenas packed with thousands, into boardrooms filled with polished businessmen who shook his hand with one face and spoke behind his back with another. He carried it into every interview, every endorsement deal, every fake friendship born out of fame. And he carried it now, here, on a plane 30,000 feet above a country still learning, or refusing to shed its oldest sins. A slight change in engine pitch pulled him back into the present. The air in the cabin had cooled noticeably, or maybe that was just his blood moving slower under the weight of the memories. He ran a hand over his face, not in exhaustion but in grounding, anchoring himself in the moment. He wasn't that 8-year-old anymore, shrinking under suspicion. He wasn't that 15-year-old, wondering if his grin could erase generations of prejudice. He was Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had built a life brick by brick, heartbreak by heartbreak, triumph by hard-won triumph. But none of that mattered to men like Holden Reeves. Men who hid their fears behind badges of authority, stitched onto uniforms or spoken through public announcements. Men who believed that humiliation could shrink giants back down to size. Shaq's gaze drifted toward the cockpit door. Behind that door sat a man who had no idea that the mask he wore was already cracking. No idea that his downfall was written into his own arrogance. The weight of responsibility, the burden of command. Holden wore them like costume jewelry, gaudy and cheap, and not the sacred trust they were meant to be. There was something Holden was hiding. Shaq could feel it. A rot that went deeper than ego. It wasn't just the insult. It wasn't just the reckless bravado over the intercom. It was the way he flew the plane. The way he carried himself with an edge too sharp for comfort. And Shaq trusted his instincts the way a soldier trusted the feel of an approaching ambush. Another memory surfaced. This one quieter, but just as powerful. His mother's hands, calloused from years of hard work, sewing a patch onto his jacket after a tear. She worked in silence, needle flashing through cloth, before finally speaking without looking up. Pride's like that jacket, protects you from the cold, but if you tear it fighting stupid battles, boy, you'll freeze when the real storm comes. Shaq had stitched that lesson into his soul, and that's why he didn't rise out of his seat now. Why he didn't demand an apology that would fall on deaf ears. He knew the real storm was still coming, not words over an intercom, but something bigger, more dangerous, and when it hit, he needed every inch of that jacket intact. He shifted his gaze to the passengers around him. Some clutched armrests a little tighter, some checked their watches too often. Even those who laughed earlier now seemed unsettled, their laughter a fragile armor cracking under the strain. The man in the bomber jacket moved again, sliding back into his seat with a look that said he had seen enough. Shaq caught the flicker of a badge tucked briefly into the man's lapel. Not a cop's badge, but something else. Government issued. Aviation related. Pieces were falling into place. Shaq sat still, the mountain in the room, patient and immovable. He knew what the others didn't yet. That survival didn't belong to the fastest or loudest. It belonged to those who understood when to stand tall, and when to dig deep, rooting themselves against the coming winds. Lucille had taught him that too. Outside the window the endless blue sky stretched on, mocking them with its serenity. Inside, silent storms brewed. Shaq tightened his seatbelt just slightly, a subtle preparation. The plane rattled again, sharper this time, unnatural, and gasps rippled through the cabin. The golden badge on Holden Reeves's chest, the one stitched proudly into his uniform, meant nothing now. Authority without honor was just embroidery. And soon everyone on this plane would see exactly what was hiding behind that false shine. Shaq leaned his head back against the seat, eyes open, heart steady, ready for what was coming. Not angry, not afraid, prepared. The hum of the engines hadn't changed, but something in the air had. It was subtle at first, a thin thread of wrongness woven into the cabin's sterile comfort. Shaq could feel it the way a seasoned ballplayer feels, the shift in a game long before the scoreboard catches up. His instincts, sharpened by years of navigating pressure, didn't need flashing alarms to tell him that something in the cockpit wasn't right. It started even before takeoff. Shaq replayed it now, in quiet pieces. Captain Holden Reeves swaggering into the cockpit later than he should have, laughing a little too loudly at a joke no one else seemed to hear. The way he barked something sharp at a stewardess when she fumbled his coffee order. A note of venom too raw for first-class theater. And then the announcement, the off-color jab at Shaq, casual. Yes, but layered with an edge that didn't belong anywhere near a man responsible for 200 lives. Now, high above the ground, the cracks were beginning to spread. Shaq shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to draw attention. He scanned the cabin again, with a slow, deliberate thoroughness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading crowds, not looking for threats, but for tells, and the tells were everywhere if you knew where to look. The co-pilot, a younger man with tight nerves visible even from a distance, had emerged from the cockpit twice already in under an hour, each time murmuring with flight attendants in voices pitched too low for confidence. A drink order misplaced here. A seatbelt light toggled too late there. Tiny inconsistencies, small enough for most passengers to dismiss, but stacked together they painted a picture Shaq couldn't ignore. And he wasn't the only one who noticed. Across the aisle, in the fourth row, a man sat with a posture too rigid to belong to a casual traveler. His name, as Shaq would later learn, was Colton Shaw, though for now he was just another sharp-eyed anomaly in a cabin full of people trying not to look worried. Colton wore a simple dark jacket, jeans, and scuffed boots that spoke of years spent in airports and airfields. There was a weight to the way he watched the flight crew, not the nervous weight of a fearful flyer but the analytical weight of someone who knew exactly what procedures should look like, and could spot the hairline fractures when they formed. Shaq caught Colton's eye for a brief second, just long enough for an unspoken agreement to form between them. You see it too. The plane jolted slightly, not hard enough to spill drinks, but enough to tighten every spine along the rows of seats. Holden's voice came over the intercom a moment later, laced with a forced humor that only sharpened the tension. Well, folks, looks like we hit a playful little air pocket. Nothing to worry about. Just shows you we're getting our money's worth out of these wings, huh? The chuckle that followed was his alone. Shaq clenched his jaw. Pilots weren't supposed to sound like that. Flippant, dismissive. Professional detachment was standard. Yes, humor was even welcome sometimes. But what Holden's tone betrayed wasn't confidence. It was instability. A man putting on a show, whistling past a graveyard. And that wasn't the kind of man you wanted holding the wheel. The minutes dragged long and taut, stretching the cabin into a place where every breath felt a little heavier than the last. The stewardesses who had once glided through the aisles with effortless hospitality, now moved with the stiff precision of soldiers marching through uncertain territory. Shaq watched as Jenna dropped a stack of napkins near the galley and didn't bother to pick them up, too focused on whatever news she'd just whispered to her colleague's ear. Shaq leaned slightly, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, angling his ear toward the cockpit. Faint sounds filtered through the closed door, not the clipped technical chatter of normal operations, but something else. Raised voices. Tension. He caught fragments. Not authorized. Protocol. Your call. Words that tasted of decisions made under duress. The worst kind. Colton Shaw stood up casually, stretching his arms as if to ease a cramp. He paced once down the aisle, slow and deliberate, eyes scanning overhead compartments, emergency exits, the cockpit door. Shaq watched him move with the kind of grace that only came from years of fieldwork, whatever field that was. Colton wasn't just a passenger, he was a professional, someone who knew trouble when he smelled it, and someone who didn't plan to sit still when it hit. Shaq felt a grim respect bloom in his chest. He wasn't alone in this. Whatever Holden was hiding, whatever game he thought he could bluff his way through, there were witnesses now. And more importantly, there were people prepared to push back when the time came. The plane banked suddenly to the right. Too sharply, too soon. Gasps echoed through the cabin as passengers clutched armrests. A baby 2 rows back started crying. A thin, piercing wail that seemed to vibrate the very air. Holden's voice crackled to life again. This time harsher. Clipped at the edges. Easy there, folks. Just dodging a little turbulence. Nothing to get excited about. But it wasn't turbulence. The sky outside was a sheet of undisturbed blue. There were no storms here, no weather maps filled with angry reds and yellows. Shaq knew enough to tell when the plane moved, because it had to, and when it moved because the hands at the controls were shaking. He watched Jenna whisper something urgent into the phone tucked near the galley wall, her knuckles white against the receiver. Across the cabin, Colton Shaw returned to his seat with a grin set to his mouth, pulling out a small leather folder from his jacket. Shaq didn't need to see the embossed federal seal stamped into the leather to know Colton wasn't just another concerned traveler. He was here on business, and that business had just turned critical. Shaq breathed deep through his nose, steadying himself. This wasn't the kind of problem that fists or fame could solve. This was a pressure cooker situation, and it would take calculation, not confrontation, to survive it. The seatbelt sign chimed again, a sharp ding-ding-ding that felt too urgent, too late. Holden's voice, slurred now, just slightly, came over the speakers once more. Flight attendants, take your seats. We're gonna get a little sporty up here. Not standard language. Not by a long shot. Shaq's hands curled lightly into fists. Not in anger, but in preparation. He looked around and saw the same thought blooming in the passengers' eyes. Something was wrong with their captain. Very wrong. The man in the bomber jacket, Colton Shaw, caught Shaq's gaze again, nodding almost imperceptibly. It was a signal, a silent understanding, that when the moment came, they'd act, together, if needed. Shaq turned his attention back to the cockpit door. It stood solid and closed, a barrier between two worlds, the known and the unknown. Behind that door, Holden Reeves was spiraling, drunk on ego, maybe something worse, dragging them all with him. And for the first time since boarding, Shaq felt the tremor of genuine fear flicker inside him. Not for himself, but for the innocence packed into this flying coffin. The mother calming her crying baby, the old man squeezing his wife's hand across the aisle, the teenage girl scribbling in a journal, unaware of how close they were to disaster. Shaq thought again of Lucille's voice, steady and unyielding. In the storm you don't run wild. You anchor down. You find your center. You lead. The plane rattled harder now, like a beast trying to shake its riders loose. Holden's voice didn't come back this time. Just silence. Thick, growing, oppressive. Shaq set his jaw, his mind sharpened into focus. The cracks in the cockpit had spread. The golden badge was nothing more than paint peeling off rotten wood. And soon, very soon, the time for watching would end. It would be time to move, time to act. The hum of the engines had long since stopped being background noise. Now it thrummed through the walls like a warning, rattling cups on tray tables, whispering in the air vents. Shaq sat rooted in his seat, a massive, unmoving force among a cabin full of increasingly restless souls. He could feel the mood shift around him. Not panic, not yet, but the early tremors of fear, like animals sensing a predator long before they see it. The plane dipped slightly, a sharp jerk that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the man at the controls. Shaq gripped the armrests, his fingers tightening subtly, not from fear but from calculation. His body remained calm, but inside, every instinct screamed, this isn't normal, this isn't right. Holden Reeves had crossed the line from arrogance into danger. It started small, as it always does, a sudden drop in altitude that jolted half the cabin awake, an unnecessary banking maneuver that tipped drinks into laps and sent a briefcase sliding down the aisle. Holden's voice crackled over the intercom, too cheerful, too casual. Just keeping you folks on your toes. Hope everyone's enjoying the roller coaster up here. Laughter, forced and brittle, bubbled from a few passengers, desperate to pretend it was still a joke. But there was no laughter in the flight attendants' eyes, as they braced themselves against the galley walls. No laughter in the tight-lipped way Colton Shaw shifted in his seat, one hand slipping into the inner pocket of his jacket to thumb whatever credentials he was carrying. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath steadying him against the building pressure. Holden wasn't just toying with them anymore. He was unraveling, and 200 lives were tied to his unraveling hands. The plane lurched again, this time with a guttural shudder that rattled teeth and sent overhead bins creaking ominously. Gasps filled the cabin, and a few passengers cried out, the sound slicing through the tension like a blade. A stewardess stumbled into a seat, her tray of drinks crashing to the floor in a burst of plastic and ice. Another rushed to her aid, but the look they shared was pure, undisguised terror. Shaq's mind raced, fitting pieces together. It wasn't just reckless flying. There was something more, something desperate bleeding into Holden's control. No professional pilot, no matter how arrogant, played games with turbulence like this. Unless he was hiding something bigger, something that could cost them all their lives. Colton Shaw stood up briefly, pretending to stretch again, but his movements were deliberate. He surveyed the plane with quick, sharp glances, cataloging exits, passengers, obstacles. Shaq recognized the pattern. Tactical assessment. Whatever Colton knew, or suspected, he was preparing for action. Another jolt rocked the plane, harder this time. Luggage bins popped open. A laptop flew out and skidded down the aisle. The seatbelt sign chimed insistently, a shrill alarm against the madness building at the front of the plane. Holden's voice came over the speakers once more, but now it was strained, almost manic. Nothing to worry about, folks. Just shaking off the cobwebs. They don't call me the wild card for nothing. There was no humor in the cabin now. Only fear. Shaq looked around, taking in the white-knuckled grips on armrests. The parents clutching their children, the silent prayers mouthed into open air. He felt the weight of responsibility press down on him harder than gravity. He wasn't the captain. He wasn't the crew. But somehow, without saying a word, the eyes of the cabin kept finding him. A silent plea for strength, for sanity, for something solid in the midst of spiraling chaos. He couldn't betray that trust. Not now. The plane jerked again, a stomach-churning drop that left half the passengers weightless for a heartbeat before slamming them back into their seats. A woman screamed. A stewardess shouted orders, trying to regain control, but it was like shouting into a hurricane. Through it all, Shaq remained still, a mountain against the storm. He locked eyes with Colton Shaw, who nodded once, grim and certain. They both understood. Time was running out. They couldn't just sit and hope the turbulence passed. Hope wasn't a plan. Shaq shifted his body slightly, testing the give of his seatbelt, feeling the energy coiling in his muscles. He didn't know exactly what they would need to do. But he knew this. Holden Reeves could not be allowed to keep control unchecked. Not if they wanted to land in one piece. The engines roared louder, an ominous growl that seemed to vibrate the very bones of the aircraft. The plane pitched left again, harder than before, sending trays, books, and phones crashing to the floor. The cabin tilted crazily, screams rising now in panicked waves. Holden's voice snapped over the speakers, this time a bark, not a joke. Everybody stay seated. I'm in control. You hear me? I'm in control. But it was clear to everyone. Holden was anything but. Shaq's mind flashed to memories of hard-fought games, where the tides turned not because of talent, but because one side lost their heads. Panic was contagious. It could spread faster than any physical threat, unraveling teams, armies, entire crowds. And right now, panic was rippling through the cabin like wildfire. He had to anchor them. Somehow, he unbuckled his belt slowly, deliberately, every motion calm, every breath measured. Around him, passengers watched with wide, desperate eyes. He moved like a mountain waking, standing slowly, a figure of stability against the rising storm. Shaq moved toward the aisle, careful to keep his steps even despite the bucking plane. Colton rose too, a few seats back, moving in tandem without needing words. They weren't rushing the cockpit. They weren't charging like fools. They were positioning anchors for the others, signals that someone was still thinking clearly. The flight attendants caught the movement, and instead of stopping them, gave small, frantic nods. Silent approval. Shaq's eyes found Jenna near the galley, clutching a wall rail with white-knuckled hands. He gave her a look that said, "Hold on, we've got you." She nodded back, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. Another savage jolt slammed through the plane, and this time the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like the fingers of a drowning god, dangling lifelines. Screams echoed through the cabin, high and raw, the sound of pure terror. Shaq braced himself, grabbing a seat back to steady against the tilt. Colton reached a panel near the cockpit door, an emergency phone for the crew, and spoke quickly into it. Shaq couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. The message was clear: we're taking steps. We're not helpless. Holden's voice barked once more over the intercom, slurring now, desperate.
No one moves, you sit down. You hear me? You sit down.
It wasn't the voice of a man in control. It was the voice of a man losing a battle with himself, trying to claw back authority he no longer deserved. The plane dipped again, lower, sharper, and the world outside the windows tilted crazily. Land came into view too close, too fast. Shaq's heart hammered, but he locked it down, forced himself to think clearly. The plane wasn't just at risk. They were minutes from disaster if they didn't intervene. Colton finished speaking into the emergency phone, his face carved from stone. He turned, caught Shaq's gaze, and nodded once. It was time. The plan wasn't fully formed, but it didn't need to be. Instinct and trust would fill the gaps. Shaq moved down the aisle, steady despite the chaos, his massive frame shielding passengers as he went. A human wall between the storm and the frightened. The plane shuddered again, harder than before. One more misstep, one more reckless act from Holden, and they wouldn't need to worry about landing procedures. They wouldn't need to worry about anything ever again. The storm wasn't outside, it was in the cockpit, and now they were going to face it head-on. The storm inside Flight 1127 wasn't roaring with thunder or flashing lightning. It was quieter than that. It moved through whispered orders, tight jawlines, and glances loaded with more urgency than any shouting could carry. Shaq felt it pulse all around him, as he positioned himself between the terrified passengers and the cockpit door. In a moment where chaos could have owned the air, control thin and hard-won held fast. Colton Shaw moved back toward Shaq with the steady gait of a man used to tight deadlines and higher stakes than most people ever faced. He carried a compact tablet, tucked low under his jacket, working it with practiced speed. When he finally reached Shaq's side, he spoke in a voice low enough that it barely existed over the engine noise. "Pilot's compromised," Colton said, his words clipped. "And not just because he's unstable. I ran a fast check through secure aviation databases. Holden Reeves. He shouldn't be flying this plane." Shaq's brow furrowed, his instincts already leaning toward the worst. He didn't speak, just gave a single nod for Colton to continue. Colton angled the screen toward him. Blurred photographs of official documents filled the tablet's surface. Training records, certifications, personnel files. Every line, every pixel, painted a picture far more dangerous than the reckless turbulence they had endured so far. Holden's credentials had been flagged, not once but multiple times. A history of disciplinary warnings disguised under internal reviews. Anonymous passenger complaints hushed up before they ever made it to public hearing. Falsified simulator reports that showed perfect scores even when logs indicated near disastrous errors. The cracks Holden had been hiding stretched back years, stitched together by favors and overlooked mistakes, buried under a system too bureaucratic or too corrupt to care until it was almost too late. And now, sitting in the captain's seat of Flight 1127, Holden Reeves wasn't just an arrogant man with a bad attitude. He was a ticking time bomb. Shaq's stomach turned, a hard knot twisting tighter. He could forgive insults. He could brush off ignorance. But this wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about survival. For the crying toddler halfway down the aisle. For the elderly couple gripping each other's hands. For everyone on this cursed flight who had placed blind trust in a golden badge that meant nothing. "We need to move," Colton said, voice rough with urgency. "Cockpit's locked. Protocol requires coded entry. But if he's losing it worse than we thought, he might not even be following protocol anymore." Shaq's mind raced. The goal wasn't to storm the cockpit. That would only escalate the situation, panic the passengers, and risk setting Holden off completely. They needed precision, pressure. They needed to make sure Holden's superiors on the ground knew what was happening before this situation nosedived into something unrecoverable. "How long?" Shaq asked simply. A soft rumble of sound. Colton checked his watch, tapping through encrypted comms. "Air traffic control's starting to pick up anomalies," he said. "If I can trigger a flagged emergency code from the crew's hidden access, it'll ping FAA override, but we have maybe 20 minutes. Tops. After that, Holden either locks the controls entirely, or worse, spirals out trying to prove he's still in command." Shaq glanced back down the aisle. Passengers huddled like figures in a storm, watching, waiting. Some whispered prayers, Others just stared at the two men they now trusted without ever hearing their names. 20 minutes. 20 minutes to pull a commercial jetliner back from the edge without causing mass panic or setting off a pilot who had nothing left to lose. Shaq squared his shoulders. Pressure wasn't new. Fear wasn't new. He just needed to find the lane and drive through it. Like he had done his whole life. But this time, the stakes were higher than championships or trophies. This was life. Plain and brutal. Go, Shaq said. One word. Solid as granite. Colton moved quickly, ducking behind the galley partition where the stewardesses, Jenna among them, hovered. They shielded him instinctively, blocking the view from prying eyes while he accessed the emergency maintenance console hidden beneath a panel. His fingers worked quickly, feeding override requests into the system, scrambling FAA protocol signals that would send a red flare straight to ground control. Shaq stayed put, keeping the aisle between him and the cockpit door like a guardian statue. Every vibration of the plane, every flicker of Holden's distorted voice over the intercom, tightened the air another notch. The passengers didn't know the full extent of the danger yet. That was deliberate. Panic would kill them faster than a nosedive. Behind the cockpit door, muted noises continued, clipped, uneven. Holden arguing with himself, or maybe with an unseen past he couldn't outrun anymore. Colton slipped back to Shaq, tablet tucked away. Codes in, they'll force a communications override. Ground control will start issuing landing commands outside of Holden's authority. It'll bait him. He'll either comply, or he'll expose himself completely. Shaq didn't ask what happened if Holden chose the latter. He already knew. Another rough lurch dragged the plane downward for a heart-stopping second, before Holden corrected it. Too hard, too fast. Baggage compartments creaked under the strain. Somewhere behind them, a man cursed loudly as a bottle of water flew into his lap. Shaq stayed still, his heartbeat steady, even as the cabin's collective pulse raced toward terror. Now it was a waiting game. Would Holden submit to the invisible leash tightening around him? Or would he snap it? The cockpit door remained closed, sealed, unmoving. Passengers shifted nervously. Some whispered. One woman began to quietly sob, muffled into her sleeve. A stewardess knelt beside her, offering gentle reassurance without saying the one thing nobody dared admit aloud. We might not land safely if this doesn't work. Minutes bled away in tight, suffocating increments. Shaq stared at the cockpit door, unblinking. He thought about every fight he had ever had to endure, where the stakes were hidden, where winning meant holding your ground when everyone else ran. He thought about his mother's voice, reminding him that real strength wasn't in domination, but in restraint, in the refusal to panic when panic wanted to own you. The plane rocked again, gentler this time, almost like a sigh. Holden's voice returned, distorted and uneven. This is your captain. We'll be, diverting slightly. Control tower's getting fussy, folks. Think they're jealous they're not up here. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was unraveling. Paranoia. Colton pressed his shoulder lightly against Shaq's. He's cracking, they're pushing instructions now, forcing a manual override. The gamble was working. Shaq watched the door, not daring to hope. Not yet. Another 5 minutes. Another silent prayer spoken by the breathing mass of humanity, clinging to worn leather seats. The plane dipped again, but slower, controlled. The first sign that the hands on the controls were being forced into compliance. If not willingly, then mechanically. Ground override protocols, cutting power, guiding the aircraft like invisible shepherds. A stewardess stepped into the aisle, announcing with forced calm that they would begin preparations for an early landing procedure. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, understanding without being told. Early landing didn't mean emergency landing, not yet, but it told them everything they needed to know.
The ground was coming.
One way or another. Shaq exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. A long, slow breath. They weren't out of danger. But for the first time since boarding, the plane belonged more to gravity than to a man unraveling behind a false badge. The weight in the cabin grew heavier as the plane began its slow descent, but it wasn't just gravity that pressed down on the passengers. It was the thick, choking awareness that their fate still hung by a thread frayed by a captain who should never have been flying in the first place. Shaq stood firm near the front of the cabin, his massive frame a steadying beacon for every frightened pair of eyes. The plane rattled again, but this time it was expected, part of the landing sequence, not the wild spasms of earlier. Passengers clung to the armrests, and to each other, their faces pale but composed. They had seen Shaq stand through the worst of the chaos without blinking, and now they mirrored that steadiness as best they could. Fear, when channeled right, could harden into resilience, and Shaq was the rock they leaned on. Colton Shaw moved beside him, the flicker of urgency still present in his eyes, but the desperation had cooled into tactical focus. They had done what they could from here. The system's override from the FAA was gripping tighter by the second, wresting control of the plane from Holden's deteriorating hands. Now all that remained was riding this descent out, and making sure Holden couldn't spin the truth once they hit the ground. Through the tiny window in the cockpit door, Shaq could catch flashes of Holden's form pacing, throwing up defensive gestures, slamming one hand down on the console in frustration. The man wasn't flying anymore. He was clinging to whatever scrap of power he thought he had left, and he was losing. The intercom sputtered to life again, Holden's voice jagged and defensive. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Just a minor technical error up here. Nothing to worry about. We're coordinating with ground control for a precautionary landing. Standard protocol. Absolutely normal." His words were desperate patches over gaping wounds. No one in the cabin believed him now. Not after what they had seen. Not after feeling the erratic drops and hearing the slurred confidence crack. The murmuring among passengers grew louder. Questions swirling in low, anxious waves. "What's going on?
Is this an emergency?
Are we going to be okay?" Shaq raised his hand slowly, palm outward, signaling calm without saying a word. His presence alone eased some of the pressure. He didn't have to make speeches. In moments like these, real leadership wasn't about noise. It was about presence. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, clipboard clutched against her chest. She was pale, her professional mask cracked at the edges, but she managed a thin smile as she stopped near Shaq and Colton. "We're cleared for emergency landing," she whispered, barely loud enough to hear. "ETA 15 minutes. The runway's cleared. Fire and rescue standing by." Shaq nodded once. 15 minutes. A lifetime and no time at all. The engines downshifted, a deep rumble that made the cabin floor vibrate like the heartbeat of some massive wounded animal. Through the small oval windows, the earth grew closer, patchworks of fields and roads sharpening into focus. Holden's voice returned one last time, brittle and unconvincing. "Everything's fine, folks. Smooth landing ahead. Appreciate your patience." But even if Holden could somehow wrestle his image back inside his own mind, it wouldn't save him. Not after this. The plane's black box would have recorded everything. The erratic movements, the override commands forced by ground control, even the drunken slur in his earlier communications. His arrogance had left fingerprints all over the crime scene. Shaq felt no triumph in that. Just a grim, weary sadness. He had seen it so many times before, in different ways. Men given power they hadn't earned, clinging to it with both hands, wrecking everything around them when their illusions cracked. Holden wasn't unique. He was just another reminder that pride without honor rotted from the inside out. The plane dropped lower still. Now the ground rushed up fast enough that individual trees and cars could be seen clearly. A voice from ground control crackled faintly through the PA system. Not Holden's voice. A new authority, cooler and professional, guiding them down. Shaq closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, centering himself. No violence, no panic, just resilience. The final minutes stretched unbearably long. The landing gear thumped down with a mechanical growl. Flaps adjusted sharply. The plane bucked once. A final jolt of Holden, fighting the systems trying to override him, but then steadied. A long, tense breath passed through the cabin as passengers gripped their seats and waited. The wheels screeched against the tarmac with a violent shudder. For a moment, it felt like the whole plane would skid out of control. A baby wailed. Someone shouted a prayer, but the wheels gripped, and the aircraft slowed, the force of deceleration pressing everyone into their seats. When the plane finally rolled to a complete stop, the cabin erupted, not in cheers, but in a ragged exhale of collective relief. Tears spilled down faces. Hands gripped strangers' shoulders. Laughter, brittle, hysterical, bubbled up here and there. Shaq stayed standing, waiting, watching. Over the PA system, a new voice came on. Not Holden's. "Attention passengers, this is First Officer Daniels. Please remain seated. Emergency response will be boarding shortly. Thank you for your cooperation." Holden had been officially sidelined. Red and blue lights flashed outside the windows. Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane like a net tightening around a dangerous animal. Fire trucks, ambulances, airport security. Shaq shifted slightly, ensuring he still blocked the aisle in case anyone panicked. But the passengers were calmer now. The end was close enough to touch. The cockpit door finally swung open. Holden emerged, disheveled and defiant. His hat was gone, his uniform stained with sweat. His eyes scanned the first-class cabin with a wild, accusatory glare, as if daring someone to challenge him. But no one moved. No one needed to. Behind him, First Officer Daniels stood tall and impassive, flanked by two uniformed security officers stepping onto the plane from the emergency stairway. Holden opened his mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to spin a lie, but Daniels spoke first, his voice low and lethal. "Captain Holden Reeves, by order of the FAA and Westbridge International, you are relieved of command pending investigation." Holden's mouth worked silently, as if trying to summon up the arrogance that had served him so well before. But arrogance couldn't shield him now, not with a cabin full of witnesses, not with data recorders, capturing every mistake, not with the truth laid bare under unforgiving sunlight. Security moved in. They didn't handcuff him yet. No violence, no scenes, but they boxed him in firmly and steered him toward the exit. Passengers sat frozen, watching it unfold. Shaq held Holden's gaze for a long moment, as the disgraced captain passed. There was no anger in it, just a quiet, brutal reckoning. A silent reminder that the real consequences were never about screaming or fists. Sometimes the worst thing you could do to a man like Holden was force him to face the truth of who he really was, without the uniform, without the swagger, without the lies. As Holden disappeared down the stairwell into waiting law enforcement, the tension inside the cabin broke like a fever. Some passengers clapped, not in celebration, but in release. Others just wept openly, not caring who. Shaq finally sat down, his massive hands resting on his knees. It was over. Not clean, not easy, but over. Colton moved up the aisle, giving Shaq a brief nod of respect as he passed. No words were needed. They had done what they came to do. The passengers would walk off this plane. They would hug their families. They would move on with their lives. But Holden Reeves's story ended differently. Not with applause or medals. Not with dignity, but with the hollow collapse of a golden badge that had never been more than fool's gold. The wheels of Flight 127 had barely cooled against the runway when the world outside the airport caught fire. It started with a single video, shaky and grainy, shot by a trembling hand in seat 7C. The footage showed Shaq towering in the aisle, calm and commanding, while the plane pitched and bucked around him. His steady presence contrasted brutally against Holden Reeves' slurred and frantic announcements over the PA system. Within minutes of the emergency landing, the first clips hit social media platforms. Passengers who had been too terrified to speak during the chaos now found their voices in captions and hashtags. Flight 1127, Big Shaq saves the day, pilot gone wild. Every angle, every perspective. Shaky cell phone footage, teary live recordings, even silent snaps of Shaq standing like an immovable pillar, flooded feeds across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok and beyond. And the world devoured it. The footage went viral with a velocity that even seasoned PR managers couldn't comprehend. Millions of views stacked like wildfire feeding itself. The algorithm spinning it out faster than any official statement could hope to catch up. News outlets picked it up within hours. The headline war began, each one trying to frame the story in sharper, more scandalous words than the last.
Hero in the skies. Shaquille O'Neal holds calm as pilot spirals out of control.
From courts to clouds. How Big Shaq became a national symbol of grace. Airline nightmare. FAA investigates shocking pilot misconduct caught on camera. Inside the terminal, as passengers were finally escorted into the sterile, overbright chaos of emergency processing, Shaq moved among them quietly. He didn't play to the cameras now swarming outside the security perimeter. He didn't give speeches. He simply helped steadying a crying child against his chest, easing an elderly woman down into a wheelchair when her legs gave out, offering a warm hand to a shell-shocked young man staring blankly at nothing. No media consultant whispered in his ear. No handlers blocked the path to his genuine compassion. Shaq was just himself, the man Lucille O'Neal had raised. Solid, humble, true. The real spectacle wasn't the pilot's downfall. It was Shaq's dignity rising so naturally it made the whole nation pause. Across the country, television anchors played the footage on a loop. their voices fluctuating between outrage and awe. Psychologists were brought in to comment on mass calmness during airborne crises. Aviation experts explained, red-faced, how a man like Holden Reeves could have slipped through cracks that should have been sealed years ago. Civil rights leaders pointed out the layers within the story, how a black man was forced, yet again, to lead by example under pressure, carrying grace in a space where he shouldn't have had to prove himself. By nightfall, Holden Reeves' name was a curse across every major news outlet. Digging into his past was easy work for investigative journalists fueled by the scent of scandal. The ugly truth spilled fast. Holden's falsified simulator records, internal complaints buried quietly by desperate airlines, the racially tinged jokes he had made at prior posts, documented and ignored. Warnings from previous co-pilots brushed aside in favor of maintaining image over safety. The dominoes didn't just fall, they collapsed spectacularly. The FAA released a public statement within 24 hours, confirming that Captain Holden Reeves had been permanently stripped of his commercial license, pending further criminal investigation. The airline, desperate to salvage its reputation, issued a limp apology that only fueled public outrage. Protesters picketed the airline's corporate offices by the second morning, waving signs demanding reform, transparency, and accountability. Holden, once so smug in his polished uniform, found himself hounded by media at his front door, cameras flashing as he hid his face behind a trembling hand. Lawsuits loomed, passenger coalitions formed, attorneys lined up like sharks scenting blood, but none of it compared to what unfolded around Shaq. He became a symbol, not because he sought it, but because the country needed one. In a world fraying at the seams from anger and cynicism, Shaq's quiet dignity during a crisis spoke louder than 1,000 pundits. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't hire PR firms to sculpt his image. He just showed up at hospitals where injured passengers were recovering, at airline hearings where reforms were debated, at small town halls where pilots and flight crews demanded better standards for themselves and their passengers. His words, when he finally spoke, were simple and devastatingly powerful. "I'm not a hero. I just tried to be the calm I needed to see when I was a little boy, scared and unseen. We all deserve better than what happened on that plane." Those words swept across every news cycle like a storm. Talk shows scrambled to book interviews. Universities invited him to speak on leadership and resilience. Companies offered endorsement deals, dripping with 7-figure checks. He declined most of them. His loyalty was to something bigger than profit now. He directed attention to aviation safety reforms. He helped establish scholarships for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities. He worked with advocacy groups demanding tighter oversight of the FAA and the airline. Every action stitched him deeper into the American consciousness, not as a celebrity, but as a genuine voice for change. Social media, usually so fickle, didn't move on quickly this time. Artists painted murals of Shaq standing tall beneath a broken plane, arms outstretched in silent strength. Musicians wrote songs about the day Flight 1127 found its anchor in the sky. Parents pointed him out to their children, saying, "That's what courage looks like." Meanwhile, Holden Reeves faded into obscurity faster than a dying star. No apology could undo the damage he had caused, not just to his own career, but to every life he had endangered with his arrogance. His name became shorthand for failure born from privilege. His legacy, if it could be called that, was a cautionary tale whispered in training centers and aviation schools across the country. In living rooms and coffee shops, in classrooms and courtrooms, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about one bad pilot anymore. It was about who society lifted up, and who they overlooked, until crisis made it impossible to ignore them. Through it all, Shaq never once raised his voice in anger. He didn't need to. His actions were louder than outrage could ever be. He was a reminder that real strength isn't about how hard you hit back. It's about how firmly you stand when the world around you shakes. Weeks later, when the dust finally began to settle, Shaq was invited to speak at a national aviation summit, not as an athlete, not as a celebrity, as a citizen who had shown more leadership 30,000 feet above the earth than many trained professionals could muster on solid ground. He stood at the podium, towering and humble, his voice steady. "We put trust in uniforms, in badges, in titles, but real trust isn't built by patches or plaques. It's built by actions, by what you do when nobody's rewarding you for it." The audience rose to their feet before he even finished. And somewhere, in the sea of applause and flashing lights, Shaq's mother's words echoed quietly in his mind. "You are not what they call you. You are what you choose to answer to. He had chosen. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. I'm not perfect, he added with a quiet chuckle that lightened the air. I've made my mistakes, had my bad days. But when that plane started shaking, when the man in charge started falling apart, all I thought about was who I needed to be for those people. For that little kid crying 3 rows back. For the grandma squeezing her granddaughter's hand. For the folks too scared to move. He scanned the crowd once more, his gaze landing briefly on the rows of young faces near the back. Aviation students, civil rights activists, future leaders. I stood because someone once stood for me. My mama, my coaches, my teachers. People who knew that standing for something, even when it's hard, even when it's lonely, is what makes you bigger than any jersey, bigger than any title. Applause broke out then, not loud, but deep. A groundswell of gratitude. Shaq closed his speech simply. We can be better, he said. Not because we're forced to, but because we choose to. He stepped back from the microphone, letting the words echo without fanfare. He didn't stay for the media scrum, or the flashing cameras waiting backstage. He wasn't interested in building another brand off a tragedy. He had said what needed saying. Now it was up to the world to carry it forward. Shaq made his way quietly toward the exit, weaving through the crowd of well-wishers and reporters. He didn't stop until he felt a small tug at his jacket. He turned. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stood there with wide, earnest eyes. He wore a too big basketball jersey and clutched a notebook in his small hands. Mr. Shaq, the boy said, voice trembling just a little. You're a real giant. Shaq knelt down so they were eye to eye. Thank you, lil man, he said, smiling warmly. But you know, being a giant ain't about how tall you are. The boy blinked up at him, soaking in every word. It's about how big your heart is, Shaq said, pressing a massive hand gently against the boy's chest. You remember that? The boy nodded solemnly, as if a sacred secret had just been entrusted to him. Shaq stood up again, ruffling the boy's hair, then turned and walked toward the open doors. The afternoon sunlight poured in, bathing him in a golden light. He didn't walk like a basketball legend, or a celebrity, or even a hero. He walked like a man who had found the one title that mattered more than all the rest. A real giant. And somewhere, watching from the sidelines, the world stood just a little taller too. Some journeys test engines. Others test souls. If you believe strength is measured by how we lift others, not how loud we shout, stay tuned. The real giants walk quietly, but they leave footprints that change everything. Keep your eyes open. The next story is already on the runway.